I walked out on a Tuesday. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. I just put on my coat, picked up the one bag I had packed 3 weeks earlier and hidden in the trunk of my truck, and I closed the front door behind me like I was stepping out to get the mail. That was the last time I set foot in the house I built with my own hands. I want to tell you what led to that moment, because it didn't start on a Tuesday. It started the way most quiet disasters start, slowly, then all at once. It started with small things I kept telling myself didn't matter. A tone of voice, a rolled eye, a chair scraping back from the dinner table before I'd finished talking. Individually, they were nothing. Together, over 6 years, they had worn a hole in me I could put my fist through. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I am sitting in a rented cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains with a cup of coffee and no one asking me for anything. The fireplace is going. The snow outside the window is the kind that falls straight down, slow and deliberate. I have not felt this kind of quiet since before my wife passed. Her name was Carol. She died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After that, my daughter convinced me to move in with her family. She said it made sense. The house was big enough. I'd be close to my grandson. I wouldn't be alone. Every single thing she said was true, and I was too hollowed out from grief to examine the parts she left unsaid. My daughter is 36. She married her husband when she was 28. He works in commercial real estate and has opinions about everything. He is the kind of man who talks over people while nodding as if he's listening. He has never once asked me a question about my life that wasn't designed to make himself look good for asking. The first Christmas I moved in, he poured me a glass of wine I didn't ask for, patted me on the shoulder, and said, "Good to have you here, old man." He was smiling when he said it. I smiled back. That was my first mistake, the smile. My grandson was 6 when I moved in. He is 10 now. He is the reason I stayed as long as I did, and I want to be clear about that. He is the best thing that came out of any of this. He likes trains and documentaries about volcanoes, and he has Carol's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that changes with the light. When he laughs, really laughs, he sounds exactly like she did. Some mornings that was the only reason I got out of bed. I paid for a lot of things. I want to say that plainly, not as a complaint but as context. I paid for the addition on the back of the house, the one they called the Great Room, and used to host dinner parties where I was never quite a guest and never quite the help, just a man sitting in a corner with a drink he'd poured himself. I paid for my grandson's private school tuition. I covered the property taxes for 2 years running when my son-in-law's commissions dried up and he didn't want to touch the portfolio. I put a new roof on the house. I never asked to be thanked. I was family. That's what family does. But somewhere along the way, what I did became what I was expected to do. The line between giving and being taken from is thinner than people think. You cross it so gradually that by the time you notice, you're standing somewhere you never intended to be. Last December, they threw a Christmas party. About 20 people, neighbors, my son-in-law's colleagues, a few of my daughter's friends from her book club. I helped set up. I moved furniture, carried in the extra folding tables from the garage, strung the lights along the porch rail in the cold because my son-in-law said his back was bothering him. By 7 o'clock, the house was full and warm, and I was in the kitchen refilling the ice bucket when I heard them. They were standing just around the corner. My daughter and one of her friends. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was standing still because I recognized the tone, low, careful, a voice being kept below the surface. My daughter was saying something about the situation being complicated, and her friend said, "But it's your dad. He's right here." And my daughter said, her voice dropping another register, "He's here because he has nowhere else to go. Where else is he going to be?" I stood there with the ice bucket in my hands, and I did not move for a long moment. Her friend said something I couldn't catch. My daughter laughed, quietly, the way you laugh when something is more true than funny. Then she said, "Honestly, I think he knows this is it for him. This is his whole world now. Us, the house, the routine." She paused. "I don't think he'd survive on his own anymore." I put the ice bucket down on the counter very carefully. I walked back out to the party. I smiled at people whose names I half remembered. I ate a plate of food I couldn't taste. At 9:30, I said I was tired and went upstairs to my room, which was what they'd named it, your room, as if it was mine, as if I had not been a guest in it for 4 years. I lay in the dark and I listened to the party wind down below me, and I thought about Carol. I thought about the house we had actually owned together, the one I'd sold after she died because I couldn't be in it without her. I thought about the money from that sale sitting in accounts my daughter didn't know the full shape of. I thought about the fact that I had been a general contractor for 31 years, that I had built things from the ground up, that I had managed crews and budgets and problems that would have broken most men, and that somehow I had arrived at 63 being described as a man who wouldn't survive on his own. I made a decision that night. I didn't act on it immediately. I want you to understand that. I am not a man who acts on things immediately. I am a man who measures twice. What I did over the following 6 weeks was measure. I called my accountant the first week of January. I had a conversation with my attorney the week after that. I made arrangements with a property management company about the cabin. I rented a P.O. box in a town 40 minutes away. I transferred a portion of my accounts. I revised my will not in anger, but with clarity. The revision took 2 meetings and a lot of quiet thought. When it was done, I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly. More like the feeling of a level finding its line. The one person I told was my grandson. I did not tell him everything. I told him that I was going to take a trip, a long one, and that he should not worry. I told him that I would call him every Sunday. He looked at me for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and then he said, "Are you coming back?" And I said, "I'll always be a phone call away." He hugged me around the middle and didn't say anything else. That child has more sense than most adults I know. I had prepaid the cabin for 3 months. I had a truck full of what I actually needed. I had a cell phone my daughter didn't have the number to, and a secondary phone she did. On the Tuesday I left, she and my son-in-law were both at work. My grandson was at school. I wrote nothing down, and I want to explain why. Because everything I might have written, every explanation or justification or accounting of grievances, would have been for them. And I had spent 6 years doing things for them. This one thing I was doing for myself. I drove south and then west and then up into the mountains. The cabin was at the end of a gravel road, a 2-bedroom place with a wood stove and a porch that looked out over a valley. The property manager had left firewood stacked under the overhang. I sat on the porch in my coat until it got too cold, and then I went inside and built a fire and ate a sandwich I'd packed and slept for 11 hours straight. I did not look at my phone for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, I turned on the secondary phone. There were 11 missed calls from my daughter, 3 from my son-in-law, 1 from a number I didn't recognize. There was a voicemail from my daughter that started with "Dad, this isn't funny," and went on from there. There was a text from my son-in-law that said, and I am quoting directly, "Where are you? We have things that need to be sorted out." Not a question, a statement with no punctuation. That single text told me more than 6 years of living in that house had. I did not call back. I sent one text to my daughter from the secondary phone. It said, "I'm fine. I need some time. Don't worry about the accounts." That last sentence was deliberate. I knew what it would do. I knew it would make her think about the accounts. I knew she would then discover that the automatic transfer she'd been accustomed to, the one I'd set up to help with household expenses, the one that had quietly become not help but infrastructure, had been paused. I had paused it 2 weeks before I left. I had said nothing. I'd waited to see if she noticed. She hadn't. Not until that moment. The calls after that text numbered 23 over the following 4 days. I let them go to voicemail. I sat in the cabin and I read books I'd been meaning to read for years. I took long walks on the fire road behind the property. I cooked real meals for the first time in years. I had forgotten I was a decent cook. Carol used to say I made the best chicken stew in the county. I made it on the 4th night and ate it alone at the small wooden table by the window, and it tasted exactly like I remembered. On Sunday, I called my grandson. He answered on the 2nd ring. He asked if I was somewhere with mountains, and I said yes. And he said he could tell, because my voice sounded different. I asked him what kind of different. He thought about it and said, "Like when you used to take me fishing. Before." I didn't say anything for a moment. He asked if I would teach him to build something when I came back. I told him absolutely. We talked for 22 minutes about volcanoes and the model train set he was working on and a book he'd started reading. When we hung up, I sat for a while without moving. Meanwhile, the calls continued. My daughter left a voicemail on day 6 that was different from the others. The others had been versions of the same theme: confusion, sharpening into frustration. Frustration looking for a shape to take. This one was quieter. She said, my name. She said she didn't understand what was happening. She said the house felt strange and that she'd told my grandson I was on a trip and he'd said he knew. She was silent for a moment, and then she said, Dad, I think I said something. At the party. I don't know if you heard, but I think you heard. I listened to that voicemail 4 times. On day 9, my son-in-law called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered without thinking. He said my name, and I said nothing. Just waited. He said there were some financial things that needed attention. I said I was aware of my finances, and they were in order. He said that wasn't what he meant, that there were joint obligations, by which he meant the property tax arrangement, which I had also quietly restructured. I told him those arrangements had changed, and that I'd notified the county directly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, What exactly are you doing? I said, I'm taking some time. He said, For how long? I said, I haven't decided. He said, That's not a real answer. I said, It's the only one I have. He hung up. 6 minutes later, he called back from his regular number. I didn't answer. I want to be honest about something. There were moments in those first 2 weeks when I questioned myself. Not the decision I was certain about, but the method. Whether disappearing without a full explanation was the right thing. Whether I was being fair. I am not a man who is comfortable with other people's distress, even when they've earned it. That is, I think, part of what had gotten me into this situation to begin with. But then I would think about standing in that kitchen with the ice bucket. I would think about 4 years of being described, in my hearing or out of it, as a man who had no life beyond what they gave me. I would think about my son-in-law's text, We have things that need to be sorted out, as if I were an administrative problem. As if 63 years of living had produced nothing more than a line item in someone else's household budget. I stayed in the mountains. I started doing things I had not done in years. I drove into the nearest town on Saturdays for the farmer's market. I got to know the man who ran the hardware store, a retired carpenter named Walt, and we spent 3 Saturday mornings talking about joinery techniques and the decline of real wood construction and what the mountains looked like in every season. I started a small project, nothing major, just a repairs list the cabin owner had mentioned, things that had been deferred too long. I fixed a broken porch step, recaulked 2 windows, replaced a section of the kitchen floor that had gone soft. It took me a week, and it was the most satisfied I'd felt in longer than I could name. My hands remembered what they were for. On the 3rd Sunday call with my grandson, he asked if I was building something. I told him about the floor. He asked if I'd taken pictures. I said I hadn't thought to. He said, "Take pictures, Grandpa. I want to see." So I started taking pictures. This is a small thing, but it mattered. Day 18. My daughter called from my grandson's school iPad. She had obviously asked him for help finding a way to reach me. I answered because I thought it was him. She started talking before I could say anything. Not yelling, that's not her style. She was careful and even, and I could hear the effort it was costing her. She said she'd been thinking a lot. She said she'd talked to her therapist. She said she realized she had said things and allowed things to be said that she shouldn't have. She said the word sorry twice, and both times it sounded like she meant it, though I have been wrong about that before. I let her talk. She said the house was harder without me than she'd expected. She said that made her realize she'd been taking things for granted. She said my son-in-law had also been reflective, her word, though she did not elaborate on what form that reflection had taken. She said my grandson asked about me every single day. When she finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I know you meant what you said at the party. I don't think it was malicious. I think it was true, as you understood it." She didn't say anything. I said, "But I need you to understand that your understanding was wrong. Not wrong because it was unkind. Wrong because it was inaccurate. I have a life. I have means. I have value that has nothing to do with what I contribute to your household. I need you to actually know that. She said, I do know that. I said, you're saying it now. I'm not sure you knew it 3 weeks ago. Another silence. Then, no, I don't think I did. That was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. I gave her credit for it. I still do. I told her I needed more time. She asked how much. I said I didn't know yet, but that I would keep my Sunday calls with her son, and that she was not to tell him anything other than that I was fine, because I was. She agreed. She asked, at the end, if I was going to come back to the house. I told her I hadn't decided yet and that the answer to that question wasn't entirely mine to determine. She asked what that meant. I said my attorney had some paperwork she should probably look at. I'd had him send it to her the week before. It was not a threat. It was a fact. The paperwork outlined the changes to my estate planning and, more immediately, a legal structure that meant the house she and her husband lived in was no longer quite as uncomplicated as they'd assumed, given certain understandings about the loans I'd extended that had never been formalized in writing but were now being formalized. My son-in-law called my attorney directly the next morning. My attorney, who is a very good attorney and has known me for 20 years, called me afterward and said simply, he was unpleasant. I told him I was not surprised. He said the paperwork had been reviewed. I said, good. I want to be clear about the paperwork. It was not punitive. I am not in the business of destruction. It established terms that were fair terms that acknowledged what I had contributed and what I was owed in return. Not financially, but in terms of respect and consideration. The money side of it was secondary. What I wanted was a framework. I wanted things to be explicit that had been implicit and therefore easy to ignore. By week 5, the calls from my son-in-law had stopped. The calls from my daughter had found a different rhythm, less frantic, more like actual conversation. She started telling me things, small things, what my grandson had said at dinner, a problem at her job she was thinking through. Once, very briefly, she mentioned that her husband had started seeing someone, a therapist. She clarified quickly, and that she thought it was helping. I did not comment on that, but I noted it. Week 6, I called my grandson on a Thursday instead of waiting for Sunday. He answered on the first ring. I told him I'd found a local shop that sold model train parts and that I'd mailed him something. 3 days later, he called me back, breathless, having clearly run to the phone. He said the locomotive I'd sent was exactly the kind he'd been looking for, and couldn't I tell him how to make the wheels turn more smoothly because they stuck on the curves. We talked for 40 minutes about gear ratios and track grades, and he put me on speaker so I could listen while he tested it. At one point, I heard him make a sound, a pure, uncomplicated sound of something working, and I had to press my hand over the phone for a moment. At 7 weeks, I drove back down from the mountains for the first time, not to the house. I met my daughter at a diner about 20 miles from where she lives, a place I'd chosen. I was there first. I ordered coffee and watched the door. She looked tired. She also looked like she had been thinking for a long time, in the way that prolonged thinking changes a face slightly. She sat down across from me and we ordered, and for a few minutes neither of us said anything that mattered. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I mean it this time, in the right way. Not sorry that things went sideways. Sorry that I made you feel like you didn't matter." I turned my hand over and squeezed hers once and let go. We talked for 2.5 hours. Not about the paperwork, not about the finances. We talked about Carol. We talked about what the last 4 years had actually been like for me, things I had never said aloud and things she had never thought to ask. We talked about my grandson and what I wanted for him and what she wanted for him, and how those things were not as different as the last several years had made them seem. We talked about what coming back might look like, and I was honest that coming back to the house as it had been was not something I was going to do. She said she understood. I said, "I'm not sure your husband does." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's working on it." I said that was going to have to be enough for now, and that I'd need to see it, not hear about it. She nodded. On the drive back to the cabin, I counted the total missed calls from both their phones combined, which I'd logged out of a habit from my contracting days of keeping records. There were 41 calls from 2 people who had stood in a kitchen at a Christmas party and decided I had no life left to speak of. 41 calls from a house that had been built with my hands and financed in no small part by my savings and sustained by my presence in ways that had only become visible in my absence. I drove back through the mountain dark with the heater on and the radio playing something low and the road completely empty in front of me. Carol would have had something sharp and funny to say about all of it. She had a gift for compressing complicated things down to one sentence. She would have said something like, "Well, now they know." And then she would have laughed, and I would have laughed, and we would have understood each other completely without having to say another word. I don't know exactly what comes next. I know some things. I know I am not a man without a life. I know I am going to teach my grandson how to build a bookshelf when the weather turns, and how to read a level, and how to drive a nail without bending it, things his father has no interest in teaching him. I know I have an attorney who is good at his job and an accountant who is better than most. I know I can cook a chicken stew that would have made my wife proud. I know that a man's worth is not measured by how convenient his presence is to other people. I know that the moment you make yourself indispensable without being treated as irreplaceable, you have made a mistake that only you can correct. I know that walking out a door can sometimes be the most powerful thing a quiet man does. And I know this. The phone rang 41 times. They said no one would miss me. 41 times. I think what they meant, what they discovered. In the only way people discover things that matter, is that they were wrong.